David Horner, welcome to ASPI.
Well, thank you.
David, why did ASIO, this most secret of organisations, decide to give up its secrets to you?
Well, the interesting thing is that ASIO never really told me why they wanted to do it, but I can speculate about it. There are several reasons why they may have wished to do it. One of them is because the British organisations MI5 and MI6 were heading down that track, but I don't think it's just that. I think that there's also a whole range of myths about ASIO, the Petrov incident, for example, but many others, and they wanted to have some of these myths put to bed for all time. There might be another reason too, and that is there are internal reasons, so that people in ASIO know how their own organisation was established and they can use it for their own internal reasons. And then if we go even further, if ASIO wants to have the confidence of the Australian people, they need to be open about what they have done in the past. And if that reveals things that might be uncomfortable, so be it. But they're willing to go down the track for that reason.
As ASIO moves into this huge new headquarters it has overlooking the lake in Canberra, overlooking on the other side of the lake from Parliament and the High Court, was there a certain element of ASIO wanting to clear the books or open the books to explain exactly what this organisation was doing?
I think it's not just the new building, but they are in a new environment now. ASIO's had a lot of publicity in recent times about terrorism. It's widely accepted in the Australian community now that it is a major part of the Australian government apparatus, and we are in a society now where there's an attempt to give much more transparency to things. On the other hand, we know that in other areas the transparency has dried up, but nonetheless, in this period of more open transparency, I think they wanted to get their history out there so people can know what they have been doing.
What did full and unfettered access mean for you as an historian and as a writer?
Well, ASIO went out with a request for tender. They set out their conditions in the request for tender. Different universities put forward their bids, and I put forward the one for the ANU. And in doing it, I laid down my own conditions.
Which were? And
they were that I would have complete access to all ASIO records pertaining to the period. I wouldn't be denied any of them. What is beyond that, there would be no censorship. That is, if ASIO did not like what I was going to write, well, they just have to wear it. Now, I accepted that there would be certain matters that could not be released for national security reasons, and there's certain, and under the ASIO Act, we can't release people's names, although we managed to in the end, release a lot of them. But ASIO accepted those conditions, and they completely played the game on this. Now, some people might say, David, how can you be sure that they showed you everything? Well, I can say that I sent my researchers into ASIO and I did it myself. We had access to their database. Obviously, we'd need to have a high level of security clearance to do that. We were never denied any file that we asked for. And what is more, we found files that they didn't even know they had.
So what sort of stuff did you find that they didn't realise they had?
Well, back in the old days, of course, it was all paper files, and very much in the early days that they didn't have their filing systems up and running. Certain issues which, for some reason or other, didn't get into their filing system, but the files were stashed away on the shelves. We actually went in there and we found these files, and I had a very diligent researcher who worked with ASIO, and he'd ask questions. I mean, such and such issues are a really important one. You haven't got any files on this. And sort of thinking about this, where else might they be? And then perhaps they were filed under different names, and eventually we were able to track them down in that way.
How much was off limits or deleted because of national security or international relations issues?
Well, I've got to say that in the long run, remembering my book goes from 49 to 63, so it's a long time ago, in the long run, not very much was cut out. There's a little bit because of international relations things. I mean, if we get information from an overseas partner and they don't want it to be released, we can't do much about that. Some of the ASIO techniques were cut out or modified, fuzzied up, if you like. And then, of course, a lot of the names could not be released. Now, there are two sorts of names. There are those people who work for ASIO, ASIO employees, ASIO officers. under the law, we are not allowed to release their names. But we would get them to sign a document when we interviewed them saying they're happy to have their name released. Then we go back to the Director General and he would release the name. So we've got a lot of those released. The ASIO agents are different. ASIO agents, people who have a day job, perhaps working in a trade union, and they also employed by ASIO in a part-time basis to pass information to ASIO. Under the ASIO's arrangements, those names are never released. ASIO couldn't recruit agents who might be subsequently embarrassed if ever their names were going to come out. So we wrote it as though everything, we wrote the whole lot. We put all the names in and everything. And then later on, ASIO went through and said, no, you can't mention that person's name. Sometimes we cut it out completely if it was a short story. Sometimes we just changed the name or just referred to the agent. But I can say, having seen everything and having told the story as best we can using the files, that we didn't change the story when we cut things out. So the conclusions that we came to were the same conclusions that we would have come to right from the beginning.
Now, the dilemma of the files, what did the files show you about the moral dilemmas that confronted ASIO in surveillance of Australians?
Well, the problem that we have with the files is that the files are directed towards gathering information on people. And so there are far more files on gathering information on people than there are, say, policy files. But I really needed to start with the policy files. Some of those were quite thin. Now, the dilemma that you've got is that if you collect information on a person, it may or may not be correct, or it might indicate that somebody had some connection with somebody in the Labor Party. And then when the time comes to vet that person for clearance, then, as the words I used in one of the chapters, the Commonwealth needs to be given the benefit of the doubt. That is, was the person a communist or not? Well, the Commonwealth can't afford to take the risk of perhaps allowing a person to have a position where they have access to information. So the moral dilemma you've got is you might be damaging somebody's career prospects based on a hunch. But that is the way ASIO had to operate.
So you have, as you say, this vast number of files on Australians, most of whom had acted lawfully and were no threat to society.
That's right. And there's a bit of a misapprehension here that people say, well, you know, there's an ASIO file on me. Well, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong at all. You've not been prosecuted, you've not been charged with anything. You may not have done anything wrong. And you can follow through somebody's file, and the final conclusion is that the person is no threat at all. But there's a great big file there. And so some people think, well, you know, the fact that it's an ASIO file on them is a black mark against their name. That's not necessarily the case.
You make the point that ASIO's surveillance of academics and intellectuals, writers and artists was, quote, a massive waste of time and resources. Why did they get that so wrong?
It was a mindset that they got. This mindset, you start with the Communist Party. The Communist Party is the threat. Then you've got the front organisations, that is, organisations that are perhaps supported or even set up by the Communist Party in a clandestine way, so that they can drag into it people who are not communists. And then you go to the sympathisers, and it's a never-ending chase, a sympathiser with a sympathiser. And ASIO had this mindset, this fixation that the Communist Party is the enemy, and therefore anybody vaguely connected with them. And they didn't stop to think, as the decade went on, the Communist Party was losing influence in the community.
In fact, in some places you had as many ASIO agents in branches as active members.
Oh, that is right. It's embarrassing. At one stage, it was embarrassing that all the members of the executive of one organisation were members of were ASIO agents, and they had to get a few of them out of it. And that's right. As the time went by, there's the invasion of Hungary, and the Communist Party becomes less popular in Australia, and therefore the threat to Australia becomes less. But ASIO never seemed to step back and say, hang on, the threat is now less than it was. Perhaps we need to do less work. But they had a head of steam up and they said, well, we need to do more work. If you haven't found some evidence, we need to look harder and keep looking. So yes, they really run off the rails in this continuous search for connections.
If ASIO was going after creative types for doing what creative types do, for thinking new thoughts and thinking about new ways of doing things, does that point to some lack of balance or judgment in the way that ASIO was thinking about Australia and Australians?
Well, we have to remember again, it's the Cold War to start this period. It's not very long since the Second World War. During the Second World War, Australia is under threat of invasion. And then we have the Cold War with the Soviets. So we have a very, nuclear weapons, a very dangerous international environment. So that's the starting point. And the people who come into ASIO are former policemen, people who've served in the Commonwealth Investigation Service, people who'd been in intelligence or similar organisations in the armed forces. These are not people who are coming out of universities who are sitting pondering the issues of the world. These are active, do it type people. And so what was needed and eventually comes in much later is saying, well, we need to get people in that are able to sit back and think about some of these issues rather than just get out there and do the job. So this is it's one of the weaknesses of ASIO in this period.
And is it a weakness, do you think, that they actually did eventually recognise and tackle?
It took a while to recognise it, and it's a bit beyond my book, but into the 1960s. There's a lot of talk about the fact that the Whitlam government came to power, and then there was the Hope Royal Commission and getting ASIO to reform. Some of that started before that happened. It started really when Charles Zpvs finished as the Director General at the beginning of 1970, and Barber came in as the new Director General, a man with a university education, and so it did start. But it takes a while for the old and bold to work their way through. That group that joined back in 1949, 1950, just out of the war, is a sort of a cohort, and they have to work their way through until a new group starts to come in with new ideas.
It's beyond your timeline, but in a sense, ASIO, like the Australian Defence Department, has to have a post-Vietnam rethink about what it is and what it does.
That is quite right, and it just so happens, it's not completely a coincidence, that the post-Vietnam rethink corresponds with the Hope Royal Commission that took place in 1974, 75, 76, with the Hope recommendations coming on board during the 1970s. And at that point, a lot of those people who joined way back in 1949 are starting to retire anyway. So there's a changeover at that point.
And do you think that ASIO at some point decided that it had won the Cold War? Did it ever pat itself on the back and say, well, we won that one?
I think so. They took great delight in, and I've mentioned in the book of sort of being able to tick off how many communist branches around Australia that they had their agents in, and how they were able to really know what was going on with the communists. And I guess they could see. Well, that took a while for them to get their mind around this. In the late 1960s, as the Communist Party splinters into all these small groups, and eventually, of course, the Communist Party itself in the 1970s completely vanishes to be. And we've got little organisations left.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that along with a lot of other parts of the bureaucracy, ASIO gets a lot of the information about, say, the China-Soviet split. It actually understands what that means, but can't put the bits of the puzzle together to actually understand what that China-Soviet split would really mean.
Yes, this is the curious thing, is that through all the people, the agents that they've got and the tapping of the phones.
They had a really good window on that.
Yes, they know exactly, or as close as anybody in Australia knows, is what's happening to
China's going its own way.
Yes, they've got the people who are supporting the Chinese, the people who are supporting the Soviets. We've got the Australian Communist Party that now wants to go its own way, and then you've got all these splinter organisations, and ASIO tries to find out what they're doing. And they don't sit back and say, hang on, perhaps this is good. They say, oh no, this is a bigger challenge. We've now got to find out what they're all doing.
It's the classic intelligence dilemma. You can get the intelligence, but to understand it and to use it properly.
And look, it's not until we get to people like Justice Woodward in the 1970s who are starting to develop an ASIO annual report, an annual assessment, which forces them to sit back and make some judgments. But that doesn't happen until the 1970s.
David Horner, thank you.